The Peninsular War, also known as the Napoleonic Wars, raged in Europe from 1803 until its culmination at the Battle of Waterloo in Belgium in 1815. There, a British-led consortium under the Duke of Wellington decisively defeated Napoleon Bonaparte and his French forces. During the years 1812 through 1814, an offshoot of the war took place simultaneously in North America, in which American forces, along with their French allies, fought off the British in the southern United States. At the same time, the Americans and French attempted to drive the British out of the Canadas in the north. British forces, in conjunction with Canadian militias and joined by First Nations fighters, led by Tecumseh, succeeded in holding them back. But it wasn't easy.
Well, the War of 1812 was a near-run thing. The United States had an army. There was a significant population. Upper Canada and Lower Canada, for that matter, very sparsely populated, no standing army. So, by rights, the Americans should have won. However, they had made some poor decisions, and we got lucky, basically. Once the war was over, the Duke of Wellington, who was flushed from his victory at the Battle of Waterloo, so was riding a bit of a political high, was charged with coming up with a defensive strategy for all of British North America. And so the three elements that pertain to this neck of the woods were the Rideau Canal, which provided a back door, so they did not have to rely on the St. Lawrence. Fortifications at Kingston, so that included Fort Henry, Martello Towers, and numerous other things that were never built, and the military settlements, of which Perth was the first.
And so begins the story of Perth. There are several theories about why Perth ended up in the middle of nowhere. Here's one of them.
It is clear that there were two locations chosen for the town of Perth. One is at where we have Rideau Ferry today. The other is essentially what we call Otty Lake today, at the north end of Otty Lake. And those were the two areas that were chosen. Perth was to go there. But the surveyors at the time were quite cognizant and aware of the Algonquin Indian tribes. And they had come to agreements with the Algonquins. And one of the agreements that they were holding to was where there was clear evidence that this was Algonquin migratory land, because the Algonquins were a migratory tribe. They didn't stay in an area. They moved constantly. But where there was clear evidence that this was on the path, they would be very careful if they came to set up a town. So if you go out to Otty Lake, the records show that it was very clearly Algonquin migratory area. And same at Rideau Ferry, which becomes Oliver's Landing. There was clear evidence that the Indians not annually came there, that they camped there, and so what is, you draw kind of a compass and follow the waters, where do you end up? Right here. And they, by the way, were not happy when they picked this spot. Their bosses, shall we say, their military bosses, would have rather it had been at either of the two other locations. But the surveyors were holding to the promises they had made.
Once the location had been determined, the next steps were to lay out the plan for the settlement and then populate it. The task of surveying and planning was done by British Army surveyors and engineers, so Perth was laid out as a military settlement.
Well, there's lots of signs in the military, but you have to know what to look for, because there's none of the traditional ones, like a garrison or a fort or even a barracks. None of that existed here. But there's all kinds of signs of the military, and one of them is actually the grid pattern and the fact that the center of town is on an island. Most bridges are actually very difficult to build. In most communities, it takes a while before they make that leap across, even if you think of Ottawa and Hull. I mean, it took a while before they took bridges across. But if there's one thing the Army knows how to do, it's build a bridge. And that's one of the first things they did when they arrived here to survey, is they lopped down a great big tree, and that was the first bridge over Gore Street. So the center of town has always been on an island. And the fact that we have stone buildings almost from the get-go.
After the layout of the town was established, the next step was to populate it.
Britain had soldiers all around the world. This is also coinciding with the start of the Industrial Revolution. So the last thing Britain wants to do is to bring all these people home. So she's actually starting to encourage people to immigrate, which also coincides with the settlement at Perth. So pay off the soldiers where they stand. So this actually solved a number of problems. So we could pay off the soldiers in Upper Canada with land, cost nothing to the British government, and that would provide a trained fighting force for when the Americans attacked again. And Britain was fully convinced that the Americans were going to attack again.
The first dominant group of settlers who were settled in Perth were two mercenary regiments, the de Mounier and the de Watteville regiments, gathered by the British Army. And they contained people from every nation in Europe, Swiss, Germans, Belgians, Dutch, French, Russian, and their descendants still live in Perth, but their names have become somewhat anglicized. Pablo, good Swiss-German name, prominent plumbing firm in Perth. Tizik, there are lots of Tiziks, descended from a Russian soldier who I think spelled his name T-Y-S-A-K, Tizak, and the Daroos, from Benoit Darut, who was a Flemish soldier in one of the regiments. And there are more and more.
It seems that the saying, "the rich get richer," was as true then as it is now.
Because when you got a land grant, the size of the grant and the size of the pension depended upon your rank, if you were a military person.
So there really is two levels of Scot even that comes over. There are those who pay their own way, and they arrive 1814, 1815, early 1816. And there are those who come over on a paid land system, or those who are, promised, given. Great. And Matheson is one of them. The house we stand in is one, located right downtown. Why? Because this is where he was given property as the person in charge, essentially the treasurer of the early settlement.
As a harbinger of things to come, the very first building in Perth proper was a tavern. It was built by John Adamson in 1816 and was known as Adamson's Inn. It was also called the Red House Tavern. For the next 10 years, its loft was the venue for almost every important public event. In 1817, one such event was the first Presbyterian service in Perth held by the newly arrived Reverend William Bell. He was the first clergyman to take up permanent residence in Perth. Ironically, he was also a man with strong temperance views. The Red House has an interesting claim to fame. In August of 1819, Charles Lennox, the 4th Duke of Richmond and Governor-in-Chief of the Canadas, was staying at the inn. He suddenly went mad at the dinner table as a result of a bite from a rabid fox. He died a few days later. The house still stands today and is still known by many as the Red House, even though it's been painted white since a few years after these events. By the fall of 1816, there were already 20 houses in Perth proper and 250 in the immediate surrounding area. The population in the area rose to just over 1,500 people, all this in the span of a few months.
In 1816, when Perth was established as a military settlement, we know from the records that there was an officer of the day. And the records show us that the officer of the day would almost essentially parade through the town, where he would read the instructions for the community, for the regiment. And then he would post the day's instructions, and he would post them on the doorpost at a building in town that we call the Red House. Although the house is painted white, it's an old story. It's always been called the Red House. So they would post it. One of the other duties that he had was to post when someone had failed to meet their settlement requirements. So if a property became available or they abandoned the property, the people who had the property, he would post it, and then tradition says that he blew a horn. So that became a tradition known as horning. And horning meant something bad had happened to a person, and he would again post that on the doorpost, literally, which, by the way, becomes the post office.
One of the things that was common was that if an officer and his lady were invited to dinner by another officer, they would normally proceed arm in arm to their host's house, preceded by their servants carrying their chairs. Because coming out to the wilderness made it very difficult to bring large things. So there wasn't perhaps enough furniture to go around if the host was inviting 10 guests, and so these little parades happened. Just as now, when we go down to hear a band concert or something, we take our fold-up chairs. And so the same traditions persist for slightly different reasons. It was written in Maclean's magazine quite some years ago in an article about Perth that it seemed to be the sort of society in those early days that was seldom believed to exist outside the pages of Jane Austen's novels. Very proper, very correct, very regimented.
By the early 1820s, Perth could boast 7 general stores. There were also several taverns, all of which, not surprisingly, were owned by former military men. So spirits were well served. But the spirit also had to be taken care of. 2 Catholic priests, Father Perrineau and Abbé Pierre de la Mothe, served as visiting missionaries to Scottish Catholics in the area for some years prior to 1816. By 1819, Reverend Bell completed a church on Drummond Street. It would later burn in 1867. Only the bell was saved, and it is now in St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church.
The building of St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church on the other side of the courthouse, and St. James Church, the first wooden church of St. James, on this side of the courthouse, and the sort of the Victorian morality tale. It's important also to say that just across the street and almost on the hill was the first Roman Catholic church, St. Bridget's. As with so many of the early churches, they were what the people could afford to build, but the town grew and the congregations grew, and there needed to be more accommodation. And as I've told you, this St. James Anglican Church got a new lease on life in the late 1850s until the present church was finished by 1861, and it's quite a handsome building. St. Bridget's got too small also, and not too far from here, also in the east end of Perth, St. John the Baptist Roman Catholic Church was built. It was built on land provided by Dr. Tom, who was an army surgeon and an Anglican, and he donated the land for the building of the Roman Catholic Church. And that, I think, is a significant thing. I think although there was some contest among denominations, as there always is, there was a general feeling that religion was good and lack of religion was bad, and that records suggest that whatever group was building a church building, members of the community of whatever denomination contributed to its building. And I think that's a good suggestion of how a community is built.
Other churches would soon follow. While Perth started as a military settlement, in 1823 another role was added, and it's every bit as significant in Perth today.
Well, that was all part of the settlement of Perth, was to provide a social, judicial, and an administrative centre for the interior. The next centre was Brockville, which was the capital, if you will, for the district of Johnstown. So that was its purpose, was to provide a centre for all development from the Rideau up to the Ottawa River. So the district of Bathurst, more or less, boundaries changed over time, present-day counties of Lanark, Carleton, and Renfrew. So it was a place to go if you needed, the services of a lawyer. I mean, we had lots of lawyers from the get-go. Any court official.
James Bolton was the first lawyer to move into town in 1824. He set up his residence and law offices in the Summit House. By 1830, 2 more lawyers had joined Bolton in town.
The first 3 lawyers in Perth were Daniel McMartin, who was United Empire Loyalist, who lived in McMartin House, Thomas Radenhurst, who was in Injava, and James Bolton, who was in the Summit House. And actually, their 3 houses are a good reflection of their politics and their personalities. Very close society and conflict. And in fact, Bolton and Radenhurst had engaged in a duel prior to the famous Wilson-Lyon duel. So no love lost amongst any of them.
A particularly dramatic event took place in Perth on June 13th, 1833.
Well, the last duel took place on June the 13th, 1833, between John Wilson and Robert Lyon, 2 law students here in Perth. And it was over the honour of Elizabeth Hughes, who was a schoolteacher, if you will. Now, Robert Lyon, he was 19 years old, came from a very well-to-do family, and he had received a very good education, of which dueling was part of it. John Wilson, on the other hand, he was 23, excuse me, he was 23, came from a very modest background. His father had been a weaver in Paisley and settled in the Maberley area. And really all John had going for him was hard work, brains, and ambition. And I said they worked for rival lawyers. So of course there's Elizabeth. She's a pretty girl, and Robert's a good-looking guy. Why not? John, on the other hand, was madly, passionately in love with her and wrote her very bad poetry. I don't think she really cared for either one of them. They were just noise, whatever. I mean, think of the age of this. I mean, these are 19, early 20s, so raging hormones. Anyway, one day, Robert Lyon and John Wilson found themselves in Bytown, we know as Ottawa today, doing business for their respective employers. And at the end of the day, they found themselves in the same tavern in Lower Town, what we know as the Byward Market, having a drink. I mean, nothing changes. Anyways, Robert, knowing how much John likes Elizabeth, starts, teasing him. And he's sort of going, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And he was hinting that Elizabeth was not the lady that she was passing herself off to be. He claimed, he had heard, wink, wink, don't you know, that she would allow men to put an arm around her in a manner that no woman of spirit should permit. So basically calling her a hussy, loose woman. John, of course, took exception to this, fired off a letter back to Perth, more or less calling Robert a cad and a scoundrel. So when Robert gets home, he hears about this letter. So, of course, he's affronted. His honor has been called into question. So he seeks out John and he beats him up quite badly. He's quite a muscular fellow. So John is now offended. And so he decides the only way he can save face in this class-conscious town, and this is it. Honor is a huge, huge thing. This is military, is to challenge Robert to a duel. This is what you do. 6 months before, there had been the Christmas party duel. Their respective employers engaged in a duel. So this is this is what you do. Now, of course, all their friends try to talk them out of it. This is a fool's game. But no, nothing happened. So on June the 13th, 1833, at 6 o'clock in the evening, in the middle of a raging thunderstorm, lots of sturm and dang going on here, they meet in a plowed field on the banks of the Tay River, just outside the town limit. There's a bit of a gallery there. This is a big thing. And anyways, and thunder and lightning, the whole thing. So anyways, they pace off. They line themselves up along a furrow, because it's June. Furrow, and they turn and they fire. Both shots miss. phew, let's go home, let's have that stiff drink. And John Wilson was all for doing that. I mean, he knew nothing about firing a pistol, whereas Robert was considered quite good, because this is something that gentlemen learned how to do. And in fact, Robert, on his first exchange, the bullet went right over John's ear. And he thought, oh my God, I'm a goner if we have to stand and fire again. And that's it. I mean, he was all set to go home, but they weren't. And this is where the dueling code comes into play. And another character in our little drama, and that's Henri Lelièvre, who many consider the evil Frenchman. We have every stereotype in this story. Henri was Robert's second. Now, Henri was the son of a French naval officer who had changed sides during the Napoleonic Wars. And for his loyalties, he was given quite a bit of land in the Perth military settlement. Now, Henri was described as a well-dressed, idle nobody by some of them. Nice, attractive young man to score to ladies, but, not going to amount to much. Anyways, Henri knew the dueling code, which I think says an awful lot about his character. And this is one of the key things. The dueling code was a set of rules that was followed by much of the English-speaking world for about a century. It was devised by the Irish, of course. The Clonmel Assizes and a whole bunch of other Irish counties in the late 18th century. And it laid out what you had to do. And the two rules that Henri brought forward were this, was when one man issues a lie, so that's the letter from Bytown, and another man returns with a blow, honor is not satisfied until 2 shots are a hit. So we've only had 1 shot and no hit. So according to the dueling code, they have to stand and fire again. As I said, John thought he was going to be a goner just because the first one. So convinced was John that he was going to die, that when it came time to stand and fire again, he raised his arm and he turned his head. He thought, no sense even looking, I'm going to die. But even though John wasn't aiming and Robert was a superior shot, John hit Robert square in the chest. Pandemonium breaks out, so there's a gallery there. Robert's body is scooped up, brought back to the home of his brother-in-law, Thomas Radenhurst, and legend had it that blood stained the steps for years afterwards. I mean, anyways, good story. Thomas Radenhurst, who is rip-roaring drunk by this time, and his brother-in-law has just been killed, gets his own pistols out and goes in search of Bolton, who is John Wilson's employer and, of course, his own archenemy. Fortunately, does not find Bolton, so no more deaths that day. Wilson and his second turned themselves into the authorities right away. So this was in June. Trial was in Brockville in August, so justice actually moved fairly quickly. So they were also obviously very good students because they were acquitted. So they come back to Perth, but I mean, he can't stay here. He can't stay here. It's just too uncomfortable. It's actually too uncomfortable for Bolton, his employer. In fact, Bolton has to close up shop. So by the end of the summer, shortly, by September, they're gone. And you're talking about, how the lawyers didn't like each other. I mean, Radenhurst and Bolton had engaged in a duel. Well, the day that Bolton left town, McMartin, the third lawyer in town, he mounted a parade through the streets of Perth, fueled with torches and alcohol. They ended up on Bolton's front lawn where they burnt Bolton in effigy. So, nice warm send-off. Now, Elizabeth, she's another casualty in this, because immediately after the duel, she loses her job. And within a couple of years, she's practically destitute. She and John actually run into each other down in southern Ontario, and John offers her marriage, and she accepts. John offers it out of a sense of honor, duty. He is the author of her misfortune, and she accepts, realizing that she really has no other choice. It wasn't, as you can imagine, not a terribly happy marriage, but they certainly made a good go of it, and they eventually settled in London, Ontario, where John had a very successful legal and judicial career. He became a member of the provincial parliament and a member of the Supreme Court of Ontario. Henri Lelièvre, as I said, who many considered the true villain of the piece, he split town right after the duel, and the last anyone saw of him, he was crossing the river at Brockville, and he eventually made his way to Australia, where he ended his days. But that ended dueling in Perth. There were no duels after that one, and it is considered the last fatal duel ever fought in Canada.
The story of the Perth Courier, which was originally called the Bathurst Courier, begins with a short-lived predecessor, the Independent Examiner.
There was a John Stewart who started a paper in 1828, I believe, in the town, and he was a school teacher. He was one of the first school teachers in the community, and he went after the Reverend Bell, who was a Presbyterian church minister here, and he and Bell did not see eye to eye for many reasons, I guess. And so that paper ceased to exist in 1834, in the spring of 34, and that's when Dr. John Cameron came along and started the Courier, but as I say, he died very early, and his brother Malcolm took over, and then it's gone from there.
The Courier would go on to play a significant role in the town right up to the 21st century. It would undergo several changes over the span of more than 180 years. Many of these changes will be explored further along in the film. A second means of news distribution was introduced in the town in 1834.
The first town crier that we actually have record of, called a crier, a man called David Hogg. Now, he appears in 1834 in the town's financial records as crier of the town. That's important because the court had criers, and to this very day, the court has criers. It's usually a constable. The constable stands up, and he used to say, "Oyez, all rise, court is now in session, the Honorable now presiding." That was the crier of the court. Again, that crier was paid by the local community. So we can actually see the records of who was the court crier. But here's the name, David Hogg, crier of the town's crier.
We call him the Bombardier because that was his rank. And there are a lot of David Hoggs who arrived in 1816, also disbanded after the War of 1812.
David Hogg was an entrepreneur. He was involved in many businesses.
He was an auctioneer, he was a merchant, he was active in the militia. He was the first High Constable in Perth. He covered the waterfront.
So he was the town's undertaker, and that funeral home is still in existence and still in operation today in the same location, just up the street.
William Morris, who had become one of Perth's most influential citizens, was the driving force behind the founding of the Tay Navigation Company.
We have two canals, the first Tay Canal and the second Tay Canal. The first Tay Canal is a direct result of the Rideau Canal. Town Father says, we got to be a part of this. So let's develop our river so we can connect to the Rideau. So they formed the Tay Navigation Company in 1829, I think. And from 1831 to 1834, they built their own canal. Now, because of their lack of funding, they have to scale things down a little bit. The locks that they build are smaller than those that are being planned for the Rideau and of a poor quality. Now, to give these people some credit, they did run their plans by the Royal Engineers. And the Royal Engineers, who were designing the Rideau Canal, did give the Tay Navigation plans the stamp of approval, that these were going to be good. Part of the problem was that nobody understood nature here and water here. All these people had been building canals in Europe, where the problem is that there's not enough water. Whereas here, the problem is we have too much water. Plus, we have this thing called winter and ice and spring breakup. So the Tay Canal locks did not last at all. They just, the first spring, they got busted apart because it's really rough rubble masonry. They were also small, so they could not accommodate the steamboats. Now, the Tay Navigation Company did have a flagship called the Enterprise. A poor name ever picked. I don't know what was. It was built in Perth, and it was launched in 1834 to great fanfare in the basin. It had lots of shareholders in it. It goes out and it gets stuck at the Craig Street Bridge. They soon get that out. There's little boys running along behind. They get beyond that, and the next time it gets stuck is right at the Tay duel, at the last duel site. This is exactly a year after the duel. So fresh in everyone's mind. So this is a bad karma. Tay Navigation Company, to keep the shareholders happy, break out the booze. Reverend Bell was one of the shareholders. He's quite disgusted by this because he's a temperance man. He's a Calvinist and everything like this. But anyways, it keeps everybody happy until they can get the enterprise off the sandbar. The Tay meanders, and so there's a lot of silting and everything like this. So it's a tricky river. So anyways, the enterprise finally departs and it never comes back again. It became a towpath, a barge canal. So you'd had to tow things up to Perth along the towpath, which still exists.
Early Perth was a dichotomy. The early population was a strange brew of disbanded officers, well-educated and cultured, and many rank-and-file soldiers, not so well-educated and not particularly cultured, who were lost without the excitement of the wars. Add to that another group of highly educated people who worked in the legal and clerical professions. The final ingredient were labourers and blue-collar workers, many of them stonemasons who worked on the Tay and Rideau canals. The people from this group were skilled, but again not particularly well educated. But there is one thing that many of them had in common. They liked to drink. A lot. In the words of Leonard Cohen, I fought against the bottle, but I had to do it drunk. Perth would battle with the bottle throughout the 19th century.
Alcohol was a massive issue here in the town of Perth. This town was awash in bars and brewery establishments and distilleries.
None of the ministers got along. They didn't agree with each other on terms of liturgy, theology, even personality. The only thing actually the ministers agreed on was temperance. Drunkenness was a very severe social problem. The place was sozzled, literally, for a variety of reasons. One, it's a military community, so drinking is a huge part of that culture. Actually, they received part of their pension in booze. So you were entitled to so much beer or so much alcohol a day or a week or whatever. And yes, and we had distilleries here. So drunkenness was a severe social problem. And this is the one thing that the ministers came together on, is that it was the first social program, if you will, and it was the only thing they could agree on was we have to do something to keep people from freezing in the streets.
And so in 1865, the Salvation Army forms in London, England, and in 1885, where are they? Town of Perth. The problems were that great. So the temperance movement becomes huge in town, and the problems with alcohol become huge in town.
Distilling was one of the first industry, distilling and brewing. I mean, Foster Street was known as Brewery Road because all of the hotels and inns, and there were quite a few there on Foster Street, down to the river. So they brewed their own close to the river. And there were several distilleries in sort of what is now the Stewart Park area.
Fortunes were made in the distilling business. Toward the end of the 19th century and on into the early 20th, a considerable amount of that wealth would be put to good use by John Stewart.
Much of the industrial base of the town came about because of the work of John Stewart, and John was a local lawyer in Perth, but more importantly, he was the nephew of John A. McLaren, the owner of the Perth distillery and the maker of the famous Perth malt whiskey. And John invested heavily in real estate and did very, very well. And when John McLaren passed away, he was probably the wealthiest man in the town of Perth. And the bulk of his estate went to his nephew, John Stewart.
Coming back to the 1830s, it was a busy time in Perth, from duels to canals, and from murders to executions. A particularly gruesome tale centers around a man named Thomas Ezbee.
There had been 3 hangings in Perth and at the courthouse, and the first one, which I think is the most fantastic story, was of Thomas Ezbee, who was convicted in 1829 for the murder of his pregnant wife and 4 of his 5 children. Thomas Ezbee lived in Drummond Township near Balderson, which is about 5 miles north of Perth. Now, Balderson today is, not very far away. Anyways, what happened was that the fall of 1828 was a bad harvest. And by Christmas time, it was going to be a bad winter. And one night, during a snowstorm, Thomas Ezbee, he picked up a stick out of the fire, he ran around the cabin, lighting everything ablaze, and he beat his family to death, with the exception of one son by the name of Joseph. And the reason Joseph escaped was because he laughed in his father's face, allowing enough time to get away. Thomas paused. Now, of course, no one knew this at the time. It was just considered a tragic accident. Log cabin, fire, these things can happen. Anyways, young Joseph was fostered out to neighbors while Thomas set about trying to rebuild a life for themselves. Now, Joseph kept pretty much to himself. He didn't play with any of the other children in the family. And in fact, he used to just, play this game by himself. And the game was he would pick up a stick and he would hit the ground and he'd yell out the names of his brothers and sisters. And when the lady who was looking after him asked, what's this game you're playing, Joseph? He said, oh, this is just a game my father plays. And which, of course, got her suspicious. She went to the local constable, who started making inquiries, and Thomas confessed. So that's February. He's arrested, he's brought to town, and he's incarcerated in the local jail. And there he remains for the next 7 months, a model prisoner. Doesn't really talk to anyone or interact. In fact, the only thing that he shows any interest in is food, which he has brought in from his farm. And actually, over the next 7 months, he becomes quite fat. Now, of course, various people come to see him, and including Reverend William Bell, the local Presbyterian minister. And I mean, Ezbee is also always very polite. A lot of what we know about early Perth is because of Reverend Bell, because Bell kept a diary and wrote everything down. Quite a, gossipy fellow in some respects, but a tremendous, tremendous source. So anyways, all these pastoral visits, he was polite, but said nothing. It wasn't until just before the trial where, again, one of these pastoral visits, just as Bell was leaving, Ezbee said, I was raised in the Church of England and I'd like to die that way. Okay, so we'll get Michael Harris over here. Anyways, August. He is tried and he's sentenced to hang, and he's sentenced to death, convicted, and sentenced to hang by the neck until dead. Now, no word went out ahead of time when, exactly when the hanging is going to be, but of course this is Perth, it's a small town and everybody knew. So the day of the trial, the day of the hanging, the scaffolding, of course, is just out front of the courthouse there, and the streets are full. We've got huskers, we've got buskers, kegs of ale. There's the Methodist preacher on the back of a wagon. I mean, like it was the Perth Fair, Maple Festival, Stewart Park Festival, all rolled into one. This was the event of the year. 12 noon, Ezbee is brought out. He's marched up onto the top of the scaffolding. Noose is put around his neck. The trapdoor is released, and there he hangs for about an hour. Yeah, it was not a clean death. Once he does die, his body is cut down, and it is interred in the old burying ground, what we know as the old burying ground. It does not stay there. His body is actually turned over to a local doctor, Dr. Wilson. Now, in these days, the only way you could study medicine was, study anatomy, was to get a hanging victim. The study of anatomy was considered immoral, because you're desecrating a human body. So, I mean, that's, grave robbing was actually really a real fear. So people would guard them. So people, didn't get grave robbers, going after rings and things, but also medical students would go after it to get corpses. So here we go. So Dr. Wilson actually had a couple of medical students. Like lawyers, you didn't go to school in those days. It was like any trade almost. You worked for somebody, you studied by doing, and after a while you wrote a test or something. So he had a couple of medical students. So here we got a corpse. So they set up a lab outside of Perth to study anatomy, and it quickly becomes a very popular tourist destination. All kinds of people start coming out to see these fantastic experiments being done, and rumors float back to Perth about, I don't know, castor oil from the brain and quinine from the liver or whatever. You know, these wonderful, wonderful stories. And in fact, they were so fantastic that the landlady for these two med students said, if this is the kind of stuff you're doing, you can sleep here, but you get your meals elsewhere. To put this into perspective, this is 1829. Mary Shelley, she wrote Frankenstein, 1820. Perth is a literate society. I'm willing to bet that there were copies of Frankenstein here, or they were at least people who knew of the book. So here you've got your very own Dr. Frankenstein within walking distance. So you can just imagine what these people are thinking. These medical students really didn't care because this was a fantastic learning opportunity. And not only did it allow them an opportunity to learn more about the human body, it also allowed them to do something else that's near and dear to every student's heart. And that's to earn money. Now, they didn't charge admission, but what they did do, at least I don't think they charged admission, but what they did do is they skinned and they tanned Ezbee's hide, made it into leather, so to speak, cut it up and sold it off. They got snapped up and people fashioned them into dust jackets, lampshades, wallets. Human leather apparently is very, very good. So yeah. Now we're left with the skeleton. We still have the skeleton. And Dr. Wilson kept the skeleton, and it was actually in his surgery. Now, so if you went there for a gummy tummy or a tickly throat, you would see Ezbee standing there in the corner. We don't have the skeleton still in town. Wilson went back to Scotland, and presumably he took the skeleton with him. Now Joseph, you're probably wondering what happened to Joseph. He did not stay in Perth, as you can imagine. This is not a good place for him. He eventually made his way to the Great Lakes, and where he got a job working on a laker. But unfortunately, about age 25, he got swept overboard during a storm and he drowned. So a tragic end to a short and tragic life.
In 1832, John Haggart Sr. purchased a wooden grist mill built in 1817 by Dr. Tom. He replaced it with a 2-story stone structure, and his new grist mill started operations in 1841. At the same site, he also owned a smaller mill that produced oatmeal. Added to this was a sawmill nearby on the Small Tay. On John Haggart Sr.'s death in 1854, John Jr. took over operations of the mills at just 18 years of age.
John Jr. quite quickly has to learn how to run a mill. And he does all right at it. But he's more interested in other things. He serves as a mayor of the town of Perth and eventually runs for federal office. And he actually serves as the MP for this area for about 40 years.
By the middle of the century, Perth was beginning to evolve. On January 1st, 1854, Perth was officially incorporated as a town. Fire protection was very poor, so in the early 1850s, town council decided to do something about it. But the town had 3 distinctive areas.
You have sort of class, where the Irish lived, where the Scottish lived, that story. And then you have this organization of where the power centers were. And you've got the Anglican church, and you've got the courthouse, and you've got the jail, all built on the highest piece of ground. And that was actually the focus. It was a military settlement. That's where the power direction was being provided. And then it shifts down to the town hall, and across from the town hall, the post office. And so that sets up another core.
As a result, Perth ended up with 2 fire companies, the Union Fire Company and the Fountain Fire Company, each with about 50 members. There was an intense rivalry between the 2 companies.
Any of the history you read on back in the old days when Perth had the 2 fire departments, there was the Union Company, and I can't remember the name of the other company right at the time. They had big competitions, and they did not get along real well. And one was always better than the other. That's not the way things are done today. We're all one when necessary. We become one great big department if the fire gets that big, and we work together, regardless of where we are.
The engine house of the Perth Fire Hall was built in 1855 on Harriet Street and still stands today. Later in 1882, a second story would be added along with the tower used for draining and drying the hose. In 1858, Judge John Glass Malik built a house on Drummond Street. One might be tempted to ask, so what? But this is Perth, so naturally this too is a fascinating story.
Judge John Glass Malik, County of Lanark judge. So, of course, a successful man. These new lots are being opened up, so he wants to build this great big grand house to reflect his stature in Perth. So, yes, he gets one of these lots. Contacts the, top tradesmen in the area and wonderful materials. He names it Victoria Hall. This is, the height of Queen Victoria's reign. So anyways, the stone for the Malik house comes from a quarry out near Murphy's Point Provincial Park on the Elm Grove Road. And actually, quite a few of the really nice stone homes and buildings in town come from this. It's a really nice sandstone. It's got, nice striations of color in it, some purple and some gold with the sandstone. Now, of course, the judge and the quarrymen, they negotiated price, quantity, date of delivery, and everything like that. Well, I guess it was a busy year or something like this, but like in all construction projects, there turned out there's some delays, and there's some delays with the stone. So the quarryman came to the judge, and he says, Judge, I'm not going to be able to deliver the stone at our agreed-upon date. Is this going to cause a problem? And the judge says, well, no, I don't think so. So anyways, great. New date comes, the stone is delivered, everything is declared satisfactory, so the quarryman, of course, asks to be paid. And the judge says, no, I do not owe you 1 red cent. You broke the contract. You were late. Well, what's the quarryman to do? I mean, this is the judge. This is the top guy in town. This is the law. He could go to Brockville, but, that's at least a full day's walk away if he was going to go on foot. And if he did go down, well, of course, it would just be his word against the judge. So he thought, well, I can't do that. So he thought, well, there's only one other thing I can do in a situation like this. Now, this quarryman was a patient man and obviously a student of Shakespeare because he knew that revenge is the dish that's best served cold. So instead of doing what you would think the normal things, I'm going to shoot him, challenge him to a duel, whatever like this. No. What he decides to do is he decides to lay a curse. And the curse is that you and your children and your children's children shall suffer and decline until this house is put to the public good. Well, the judge just kind of laughed it off because he got all this stone for free. I mean, this is a big house. Apparently he stiffed other tradesmen too. I encountered a number of years ago, the front parlor, which is now the chief administrator's office, has like a mini Sistine Chapel. There's these cameos of Byron, Shakespeare, Keats all on the ceiling. Anyways, apparently he didn't pay the painter either. So anyway, time goes on. Turns out that the Malik family is a rather sickly lot. Now, nothing dramatic, nothing scandalous, but none of them live to a ripe old age. If you go out to the cemetery, Elm Grove Cemetery there, everybody dies young, with the exception of the judge. And in fact, the judge buries 3 wives before he himself shuffles off. Again, nothing scandalous, just, your regular 19th century stuff. So by the beginning of the 20th century, the house is empty. There are no Maliks left. So the Great War comes. Many of Perth's sons and daughters go overseas, and of course, quite a few do not come back. Those who do come back want to do something to remember their friends. Perth did not have a hospital, but here's this big house, big property, and it's empty. So they raise money and they buy it, and so the house becomes something for the public good.
One of the first vestiges of the modern era arrived in town in 1859, the Brockville and Ottawa Railroad. Unfortunately, as it was only a branch line, it proved to be a false start and had very little impact on the town. Henry D. Shaw, who was the son-in-law of Roderick Matheson, launched his store beside Matheson House on Gore Street. It was a dry goods store that sold a wide variety of merchandise. He was involved with the store until his death in 1886, when his son Henry M. Shaw took over. Henry M. would be followed by his son Henry F. The Shaw family would run the store until the 1970s. It's still in operation in 2015 under different owners. Every town needs a place to conduct its business. There was a determination among many that Perth's new town hall should have its own special character.
I always find it quite interesting to juxtapose the town hall with St. James, because they're both built at the exact same time. Both of them going early 1860s, but completely different styles, but both very much reflecting the philosophy behind them. So, Gothic in the 19th century was considered the proper style for churches, especially Anglican churches, and then it's gaining popularity in the secular world too through people like Thomas Fuller and Chilean Jones. Georgian neoclassical architecture is considered very, very passé. This is old stuff. This is 18th century stuff. So why are we building a town hall in ancient architectural style? Well, it's conservative and it sends out a good message that we are going to, we're conservative, we are going to govern this town well. No frivolous hanky-panky with stuff. So that's why it is. Two different styles, quite different, but the philosophy behind them, it's the images that they're trying to protect. So, but it is quite a fine example. I mean, it's got some other little flourishes in there, a bit of Italianate there with the rounded windows and the dentling to give some acknowledgement to some modern architectural fads at the time, but definitely to give a presence of this is a well-run, well-administered, solid community.
And that building had a 600 or 700 seat theater in the upper floor. And so that took over most of the performances. Robertson's Music Hall became known as the Temperance Hall, and the Temperance League put on their performances in there right up into the 1890s. And they would do quite a few performances over the year, but touring shows and the big productions by the local groups would be done in the town hall. We have in the records a slip of paper, it's part of a telegram from R.W. Marks of the Marks Dramatic Company, addressed to the town hall that just says, book me the Perth Theatre for the following dates. And that's the way you did it back then. You didn't have to sign a contract. You just sent them a telegram and it was there when you arrived. So the town hall was extremely active, actually right up into the 1950s. And the events were still happening up there, and then it was renovated. I'm not quite sure the dates. I think it was in the 60s, and they became the council rooms up there and offices, and the theatre disappeared.
In 1875, Perth High School emerged from the old grammar school division of the public school. Its status would soon be upgraded.
The Bathurst District Grammar School was founded in 1824, and by 1847 it had become the Perth and District Grammar School. The 1850 Common School Act required that all common and grammar schools join together, which forced the Perth and District Grammar School to merge with the local common school. And they got together in 1852 at the location on Foster Street, where a nice new building had been created. And for the next 20 or so years, they shared the same facility. But in 1871, the Act to Improve the Grammar Schools was passed by the province of Ontario, and that required first of all grammar schools to change names from grammar schools to high schools. So the Perth Grammar School at that point became known as the Perth High School. And they started realizing that the Board of Education in Perth started realizing that perhaps this building was becoming too small for both the common school and for the new high school as well, and a space was being looked for to move the high school. Location was found on Victoria Street, which is the location of the high school today, and in 1877 the new school was finally opened, and the Perth High School was now in its own location at that point. By 1881, the Perth High School had changed name to the Perth Collegiate Institute, and the reason for changing to a Collegiate Institute is the Perth High School, as it had once been known, had met the requirements to becoming a Collegiate Institute. And a Collegiate Institute was supposed to be a more elite learning institute than a high school. So you could have a lot of bragging rights by being a Collegiate Institute.
The lights came on in Perth in 1873 as the Canadian Electric Water Power Company was formed. The electricity was generated at the Haggart Dam. In the late 1870s, Perth was on the verge of entering a golden era. One of the key players in the making of this boom was Thomas A. Coad.
T.A. Coad was my grandfather's uncle, an interesting individual. Now, he originally had a tannery on the Tay River, just down the hill from the Summit House. Now, the Summit House at that time had an apple orchard, and T.A.'s employees, I guess one fall, were snitching apples out of the orchard. So this brought the two owners together, Mr. Ryan, who lived in the Summit House, and T.A. Well, I don't think they talked about apples very long. I think they got talking about business because Ryan was a contractor, built a number of houses here in Perth, and he had connections all over the place. And so this is the 1870s when the Canadian Pacific Railway is under construction. And Ryan had connections to the CPR. So they're sort of talking about, well, how can we benefit by this? And I guess TA wanted to get out of the tannery business, which is not a very nice business to be in. And anyways, they came up with socks, decided to manufacture socks, because one thing that workers need is socks. So he learned how to manufacture socks. And he bought, there already was a mill where the Coads mill is now. It was a much smaller facility, so we ended up buying that, and eventually, I mean, of course it did very, very well. I mean, it's a huge complex that was built on over time. And it was a good location because you could wash the wool in the river, and then they would spread it out on the grass in the area that's known as Coads Park to dry it. So eventually, he had enough money to build a house, and that's the house directly across the street from Coads Mill, a very grand Edwardian building, which is named Kinnevie, after the birthplace of his wife in Scotland. I mean, this is a big, big house, very expensive to run and operate, and we all sort of looking at, ways to better heat our things and using alternative energies. Well, I think he was definitely in the vanguard of this, because what he did is he built a tunnel underneath the street connecting his factory to his home, and he diverted the steam from his factory to heat his home. So it was industrial felt originally, so going from just the woolen socks and various other, looking for various products. They also sold poodle skirts, the felted poodle skirts of the 1950s.
John Haggart Jr. wanted barges to have access to his mills. So in 1882, he used his extensive influence as a member of Parliament and cabinet minister to spearhead a drive to upgrade the Tay Canal.
1880s comes along, mining develops in this area. We have quite a bit of mining, including in the Port Elmsley area. And the local MP, John Haggart, who is also a very keen businessman, successful businessman, he convinces the House of Commons to buy the assets of the defunct Tay Navigation Company to rebuild the Tay Canal so it could be used to transport mined goods out of the area. Now, he's pretty much laughed out of the House of Commons because this is a backwater canal. It goes to Perth. It's 8 miles long. Why are we spending money on this? Nature's on his side. This is in the days when mills are powered by water. We'd had a few dry summers. The mills are idle, putting people out of work. John Haggart owns a mill, as does as one of his colleagues in the House of Commons, Moss Kent Dickinson, who owns Watson's Mill in Manotick. And they're managed to convince that, yeah, we have to improve the Tay Canal because the Tay River is the major tributary for the Rideau all the way down to the city of Ottawa. So we need to have controlled water. So they buy the assets. They improved the canal, they shortened it, they bypassed Port Elmsley, the village, reduced the number of locks from 5 to 2, built it to the same standards as the Rideau. It was used for commerce, again, never to the extent that was promised, like a lot of government projects. Yeah, there were steamships that came up to Perth. There was warehouses and wharves in the basin. They redid the basin, and also this also coincides with the rise of leisure and cottaging. So it becomes the vanguard, if you will, of recreational activities in the Rideau Lakes.
Haggart's ditch ran far over budget, and work was shut down before it was fully completed. On the plus side, the work that was completed resulted in improved locks and the beautiful basin that make it possible today for so many tourists to reach Perth via the waterway. Up until 1883, firefighting was done with horse-drawn wagons that had reservoirs for water. It was filled at the river and then driven to the site of the fire. but several time-consuming trips back and forth were usually required. So the Union Fire Company bought this state-of-the-art Ronald steam fire engine for the princely sum of $3,700. It was a significant improvement. Not to be outdone, 2 years later, the Fountain Fire Company had an engine of their own constructed by one of the local foundries. Though it too was an improvement, it didn't live up to the quality of the Ronald steamer. In 1887, the telephone, hot off Bell's laboratory table, made its appearance in Perth.
Yes, the first telephone exchanges in Perth. Dr. Kennedy was a dentist in town who lived on Darcy Street, something known actually as the Scottish row houses, because they look very much like the row houses in Edinburgh. Now, Dr. Kennedy, he was friends with Alexander Graham Bell's father. They had known each other back in Scotland. And when the two families emigrated to Canada, they kind of kept in touch. So when young Alex came up with this device, and Dr. Kennedy thought, well, there's a novel idea. This would be really convenient to have one telephone in my home and another one in my office. So, you know, if I need to pick up some milk and bread on the way home, my wife can call me. So that was the very first telephone connection, if you will, in Canada, was between Dr. Kennedy's home on Darcy Street and his dental office downtown.
Question: how many grilled cheese sandwiches could you make from 22,000 pounds of cheese? Answer: 1. If you had slices of bread that were about 20 kilometers square and a griddle big enough to put them on. Okay, so the math may not be accurate, but it would be huge.
Perth still advertises itself as aged to perfection. Like a good cheese. The biggest cheese ever made was made in Perth, yes, and went to the World Fair in Chicago.
It was the Canadian Dairy exhibit at the Chicago World's Fair, 1893 Chicago World's Fair, which in my opinion was one of the most amazing events ever. Every time I read about the World's Fair, something new, wonderful, exciting happened at this amazing event, and then it was gone. Promoting the Canadian dairy industry, cheese making. So it was an official government Department of Agriculture exhibit. I think Perth was chosen because it was close to Ottawa, and we had a lot of cheese factories. Milk from 10,000 cows over 3 days was brought to these 12 cheese factories. And over the next 7 months, the cheese was manufactured. So by April, you've got this 11 imperial ton cheese, 22,000 pounds. Launched with great fanfare from the train station here in Perth. Perth Citizens Band pops up everywhere. There it is to send it off. And, well, it's a milk run to Chicago. This was people all the way to Chicago would come to the train station to see this cheese. And there's some wonderful photographs of it going through. So it gets to Chicago. Time for the World's Fair. And it's placed on the second floor of the exhibition hall it was in. Initially, did not stay there because it cracked the floor. So they had to move it downstairs. It was a very hot summer in Chicago, which I think is probably hot every summer in Chicago, but everybody knew you could smell this prime piece of cheddar there. At the end of the World's Fair, Thomas Lipton of Lipton Tea bought the mammoth cheese, and he took it back to London, England. And there he sold it to a cheesemonger, A.J. Rowley on Tooley Street, who chopped it up and sold it off. It was a great gimmick. And there is still one piece that the Perth Museum has, so I haven't seen it on display lately, but it's pretty shriveled up. So
1892 also saw the launching of the James and Reed hardware store at the corner of Gore and Harriet Streets. The business would evolve into a very colorful and very impressive enterprise, with George James and his brother Lawrence at the helm.
We talk about marketing in this day and age, but back in the 20s, the 30s, during the Depression, I mean, George and Lawrence were masters of marketing. Everything that went out, they owned a foundry, they owned a machine shop. Everything they made, everything they fixed went out of the shop with their name on it. They made their own fishing tackle, they made their own pig rings, they made all door stops. Anything made of metal they would make in the foundry, and anything that needed to be fixed, they would fix right in the machine shop. So if you bought something from George or Lawrence Dames, you didn't have to hunt down a warranty and then talk to somebody in a different city or country. You walked down to the hardware and said, "George, this broke," you know, and he either gave you a new one or he fixed it. And it was that simple, really. They sponsored the local Santa Claus parade. Every year, Santa would arrive in Perth by way of train. They said he came from Peterborough, and then he would arrive in Perth. George James had a circus wagon that his dad had been given in exchange for some work that had been done. The story goes that the wagon originally belonged to the Barnum and Bailey Circus, and when they were passing through town, George James's dad did some work for the circus. They couldn't pay him, but they left him a wagon. And it stayed here in Perth, and for years it would pick Santa Claus up at the train station in Perth, and he would then take him down to James Brothers Hardware, because George and Lawrence, of course, wanted every kid in town to go to the hardware store at Christmas time. And so they rigged up this carousel that used to sit in the front window of the hardware store, and it would turn continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with all of the latest toys on it. And so the children of Perth could go down, and one of the Gus Quattrochi, a longtime resident of Perth, speaks of years and years of standing in front of that window at the James Brothers Hardware and watching those toys go around in circles. So it was a real hub of activity.
Well, James Brothers Hardware, of course, they've been there. They've been a fixture there for years, and we used to go up there to buy something, and they'd have to use the ladder to go up the ladder to get something up higher, and so on. And they had their machine shop where they did repairs.
From the start, a significant portion of the population of Perth had an interest in the arts. Music and theatre have always been, and to this day still are, well represented.
You can have a very pragmatic community that's dedicated to making things, to industry and so on. But if you have a community that loves itself, that's interested in its history, history of people, history of accomplishments and so on, it sort of broadens the horizon a little bit. Proud of its educational facilities and so on. It's possible for the arts, for art, for literature, for acting, to find a place, perhaps more easily. It's more easy to pass yourself off as a musician in Perth, a town that has 26 music groups, you know. To grow your hair a bit long and want to be an actor in a town that has 3 active theatres. Yeah, they feed on each other, I think.
In the 1890s, one troupe of entertainers gained international fame and success.
And they toured all over the upper part of North America. They played reputedly to more than 8 million people in the course of their 40-year career, in horse-drawn carriages and steam locomotives. In perspective, Stratford Festival is just about 60 years old now, in the era of jet planes, and they have played to about 14 to 15 million. So that's the difference in impact that they had. The Marx Brothers were voted by Maclean magazine as Canada's entertainers of the half century in 1950. They had this huge impact, and they brought legitimate theatre to any town big enough to be able to put some planks over some boards and play it. They stayed away from big places like Toronto. They didn't play those because they knew that their brand of rough and ready theatre wasn't going to be accepted in the big places. So they played the small towns. R.W., the oldest, is considered to have been one of the real pioneers of Canadian theatre. And it was rumored that he played Hatfield, Minnesota, the week after the great Jesse James raid. And he always claimed that he had had his hat shot off his head by a cowboy once. And the Marx Brothers were 7 brothers from Christie Lake, big Irish lads, and they were as rough and ready as their audience was. They had a method of dealing with troublemakers in the audience, which in the days of cowboys could be quite a few. They would separate so that they could triangulate and find the troublemaker, and they would do what they called going over the footlights, which was diving into the audience and beating up the person who was causing the trouble, throwing them out of the theater, and continuing the play. That's the sort of life they lived in the early days. But by the 1900s, they were known as the Canadian kings of repertoire. They had as many as 4 companies going out across Canada, upper United States every year, doing 15 to 20 plays per company, and all of them different companies, different plays, so that they had this vast repertoire of plays that they could pull out at the drop of a hat. And when they arrived in town, they had their silk hats, their cravats, their diamond stick pins, their diamond rings. And when they arrived, it was literally a parade from the railroad station to the theater. And R.W. had trained his dog, a little pug dog, to hold the reins of the lead horse in his mouth and lead them all to the theater. So people turned out in droves just to see them arrive. And that's the impact they had. One of the clippings that we have in our archives is a political cartoon from an out west newspaper, which has Wilfrid Laurier giving a speech to an audience of Western farmers. And one of the farmers turns to another and says, "Ha ha, old Wilf's as funny as Tom Marx." So that's how famous the Marx Brothers were. And they came from Perth. And their legacy continues to this day. So they played, getting back to the Balderston Theatre, they played the Balderston Theatre many times. It was considered their home theatre. And in fact, the opening performance in 19 starred Miss Kitty Marx, who was the wife of Tom Marx, who was the comedian of the group. And Tom lived to 1933, I think. The latest clip that we have about the Marx in specifically is a notice from 1931 that R.W. was rehearsing his company at their home in Christie Lake. So as late as 1931, they were still active. So.
He went to Maberly and he played the mouth organ. And he was quite a performer. And he performed in Maberly, and he got such a turnout when he went back the second time. And that's how they started the show business. Yeah, and they lived in Arleydale Lodge. It was a great big kind of hotel on Christie Lake. Anyways, that's where when they traveled, then they all came back and they had parties up there, and I guess it was quite the carryings on sometime.
Happy New Year!
On the very first day of the new century, the brand new Perth Arena opened. It was built at a cost of $4,000.
The Perth Arena Company was founded in 1899 with its sole purpose of creating a covered arena within the town of Perth. They did enlist, or rather they contracted W.J. Rabb of Ottawa to build the arena for $4,000. And on January 1st, 1900, the arena was opened for the people of Perth. And within 15 years, the James brothers, who owned the local hardware store, had purchased the arena. Even though it was named the Perth Arena, it ended up taking on the name of the James Arena throughout the many years following.
As the 20th century dawned, the population of Perth had grown to over 3,200. It had an assortment of smaller mills, tanneries, foundries, furniture factories, and so on. There were also several service and commercial businesses, such as banks, law firms, hotels, and retail stores. But things were about to ramp up, primarily because of one man, John Stewart.
John was a local lawyer in Perth, but more importantly, he was the nephew of John A. McLaren, the owner of the Perth distillery and the maker of the famous Perth malt whiskey. And John invested heavily in real estate and did very, very well. And when John McLaren passed away, he was probably the wealthiest man in the town of Perth. And the bulk of his estate went to his nephew, John Stewart. And John Stewart decided to invest a lot of money in industry. He felt that to keep the town strong and vibrant, it needed an industrial base. And so he began discussions with various companies, the Andrew Jergens Soap Company, which eventually became the Perth Soap Company, and Wampol's Pharmaceuticals, which was originally owned by Joseph K. Wampol from Philadelphia, but eventually John Stewart and the Danner family bought the American interests out, and it became totally a Canadian-owned company. So if you travel the corner of Sherbrooke and North Street here in Perth, in the span of 2 blocks, you will see 3 major industrial locations there: the shoe factory, and the soap company, and the pharmaceutical company. John left little to chance. Knowing that he needed to attract good industrial workers to the town of Perth, he decided that he would also build houses, because John claimed you couldn't have good workers if they didn't have any place to live. And so he owned extensive real estate holdings in the town, and he used a block of it to build what they called the Wampole houses, which were houses built to house the employees of the Wampole factory that John Stewart ran. John, as I mentioned, had inherited most of his fortune from his uncle, John McLaren, who was a distiller who made whiskey. John Stewart ran as a provincial member of Parliament, and at the time when he was running, he ran on a prohibition platform. And some people reminded Mr. Stewart that it was difficult to run on a prohibition platform when you were running the biggest whiskey distillery in the country. But John assured everyone that the distillery was being closed down, and what they were now selling was simply inventory that they had housed in various buildings around Perth. And so by 1915, John had closed down most of the distillery here in Perth. He actually owned a couple of distilleries. He not only owned the McLaren distillery, but he also owned the Spalding and Stewart distillery, which was another well-known distillery here in Perth. And what John decided he would do, this was in 1919, that he would take the land where the distillery had once been, and in a goodwill gesture, he would offer that land to the town of Perth. The stipulation was that the park, or the land, had to be developed, used as a park, and that park had to be known as the McLaren Memorial Park in memory of John's uncle. But for some reason, the transfer of land between John Stewart and the town never took place. And it was almost 30 years later, in 1948, I believe it was, that John Stewart's widow, Jessie Stewart, gave the land to the town, but this time it was in memory of her husband, John Stewart. And so today, in Perth, we have the Stewart Park Festival. We also have Stewart School, which was built on land donated by Mrs. Stewart as well.
There was one new development in Perth in 1908 that apparently wasn't taken very seriously by some observers at the time. The arrival of the first automobile in town.
In case anyone wonders, the first person to own a car in Perth was Senator Peter McLaren, and it was a 1908 Maxwell. Senator McLaren had made his fortune in lumbering and certainly could afford an automobile right off the assembly line and a chauffeur to drive it and someone to fix it, probably a local blacksmith back in those days.
So who's laughing now?
Many small towns did whatever they could to attract a factory to their town because large factories provided great economic spin-off to a small town. And Perth was no different. So they contacted the Wynne family of Milton, Ontario, and the Wynne family owned a shoe factory in Milton. And a couple of members of the Perth Town Council went down to Milton and they said to the Wynne family, you know, if you ever decide to relocate, we can give you free land and $20,000 to come to Perth. And eventually, not right away, but eventually the Wynne family did come. And they built a 2-story brick factory and began to make shoes in Perth. But unfortunately, they weren't good business people, and within a year, the business was, as they said, financially embarrassed. Well, financially embarrassed meant they were basically losing a pile of money, and the $20,000 interest-free loan that the town of Perth had given them to come here was not getting paid back at all. And so a few of the local businessmen suggested that the Wynne family may want to relocate again, which they did, which means they simply left town. And a few of the well-known business people in Perth took over the shoe factory. And this was 1912, and with the war in 1914, orders began to pour in for boots and other military items that could be produced here, and the factory was doing very well by this time. But the problem with the shoe industry is it's always catch-up. You need all of your money up front. You need it up front to buy your leather. You need it up front to build your factory. You need it up front to pay your workers. You don't see a return until those shoes are made, have been shipped out, and then eventually are sold in the stores. And that places a financial burden on any company trying to produce shoes. And it was the same with the Perth Shoe Company. And in 1916, John Stewart bought the company, became the majority shareholder, and all of a sudden the company had the financial clout that it had not had for the previous years. And so under the John Stewart years, the company was very successful, and it's during those years that the third story was added to the brick factory on the corner of Sherbrooke and North. Originally it was 2, but during John's years they added a 3rd floor.
In 1914, the cataclysmic Great War would break out in Europe. As in all other communities across the nation, many of Perth's young men would answer the call. Sadly, 48 of them would not come back. Their names are preserved both at the memorial in front of the Great War Memorial Hospital on Drummond Street and in the wonderful Hall of Remembrance on the upper floor at the Legion on Beckwith Street. But even in difficult times, life goes on, and diversions become important. In 1915, Colonel J.M. Balderson built a spectacular new theatre on Gore Street.
In 1915, Colonel J.M. Balderson, one of several Balderson brothers in the area, had already purchased the land that the Balderson Theatre was on, but he took down whatever structure was there and built the Balderson Theatre at a cost then of $150,000. In today's money, that's $8.3 million. So it was a significant project and was considered the most elegant theatre between Toronto and Montreal. Certainly one of the largest at 1,100 seats, 1,085 seats actually. And from the very beginning, it was a major part of the touring circuits that were in town in the era at that time. It was part of the Keith's circuit, which meant that people like Harry Houdini played there. And also on Keith's circuit, people like Jack Benny, W.C. Fields, and many others of that ilk. So they probably played here at some time too. Also from the very beginning, Balderson was a very smart cookie, and he brought in movies, silent pictures at first. Among our archives, the very earliest we have of the Balderson Theatre is a movie advertisement from 1916 for a movie called The Heart of the Blue Mountain, which was, by the look of it, a dreadful melodrama, but the sort of pictures that were going around at that time. And right from the very beginning, that was a part of the Balderson Theatre, because just about the time that Colonel Balderson spent all of that money building his magnificent live theatre, of course the movies were starting to kill. The touring circuits, the vaudeville circuit, and so on, and that was starting to disappear. So he managed to get his feet in both camps at that time and keep things going. By 1930, it had got to the point where movies were the mainstay of entertainment, and so the Colonel renovated the Balderson Theatre into a talking movie house, talkies being the new thing at the time. It still maintained live theatre, live performances, but by then it was mostly local events put on by the Temperance Society and things like that. But they continued with live performances, again, right up into the 1950s. We have a lot of records of performances by many different local groups that happened in the Balderson Theatre. So by 1930, it was mostly movies. We also have a advertisement from a Perth Courier from 1929 when he brought in the jazz singer. So he must have brought some sound equipment in just for that one event, because he didn't do the renovation for another year.
Massive social, economic, and technological changes were about to sweep the world, and Perth would be no exception. But that's a story for another time.